when it gets tough, e.g. you're stuck in Antarctica longer than you wanted to be and there's a global pandemic and whatnot, you've got to get comfortable with the fact that you're going to have to make unpopular decisions and you're not going to be friends with everyone, and you need to just go, right, are the decisions I'm making the best for everyone as a community? And if that means that there's a few individuals that don't see it that way or they don't want to understand it, that's not you, that's them. And it's really hard to get that, because you as a human and myself, I always felt it's like you want group harmony.
Welcome to Be Human, David.
Thanks, Jen. Good to be here.
So where I would love to start, I mean, you've had quite the adventurous life. I'd love to start off when you were an infantry platoon commander. And I'd love to know, what did that give you that you didn't have before that you use today?
It's a good one. So I was an infantry platoon commander, and I was very young as well. So I was only 22, 23 when I led a platoon on operations in the Solomon Islands, which was markedly different to training. And I think the one thing I learned there, and I've carried on with me ever since, was that when you're in a leadership position, and as such as I was, you're quite young, you don't have a lot of experience, you've got a lot of training, and you've got a lot of confidence / arrogance as a young lieutenant, and
self-awareness.
And that's exactly the answer. Have that self-awareness of know your limits and know what you don't know, and don't be too proud to admit it, and put your ego aside to listen to those around you, listen to the experts, and use the knowledge, but still back yourself that you need to make the decision. But the more informed you can be about it, and the more you've engaged with everyone who might have an input or experience to add to it, and then you can make the decision. They'll actually generally, if you can still make the right call, they'll back you. And I think I've carried that forward from other professions, through diplomacy, and then with the Antarctic program and Antarctic expeditions, that you'll quite often not be the expert on anything around you. And I think when I was the station leader down in Antarctica, you're actually not technically qualified on almost any of the trades or skills around you, but your job is to bring them all together and use everyone else and make sure that they're communicating about the right things, and kind of just make sure the right people are talking to each other, and you can go from there. So that was the one thing I was glad I learned that at such a young age as well, to go, that was really, really key, really important to go from there.
And that sort of inner confidence / arrogance, is that something that you've sort of always had within you, or is it something that was more sort of developed when you went into that position?
I have some interesting kind of opinions on this that are quite interesting, or hopefully interesting, is that to some degree, as a young junior officer in the army, you're a lieutenant, you're 23, 24, you've had all the training, you've read all the cool war books, you've watched all the movies, you want to get out there and do it. Like, that's kind of it's the stereotype for a reason, because you should be kind of a bit cocky and a bit arrogant and a bit, overconfident. But also at the same time, and understand that you're doing that to mask all your own insecurities and your own lack of experience. So kind of like play the role and play the part that you're supposed to be playing, because that's what's expected of a young lieutenant, is to be that confident thing. But at the same time, be aware that you're masking your own insecurities by playing that role, and be humble in it. And that it's contradictory, but at times you just have to go, well, I was a bit confident. I was a bit, perceived as, you could be perceived as arrogant in certain roles. But you go, but that's what was happening. Say like a football coach, you may not be that aggressive and that hard, but when you're in the coaching role, maybe at times you do have to just go that little bit harder and go, that's what I need to do on that day. And it kind of comes back to another mantra I've like to use is that, lead the team you've got and lead the situation you're in, that at times you'll have to really adapt your style to one particular scenario and one group of people that won't work in another scenario with a different group of people, and just reading that and changing. And
at that point in your life, who did you look up to?
I looked up to the kind of the platoon commanders of, the sort of Vietnam era and your World War II era, your Band of Brothers, Dave Hack, for those readers out there, like Dave Hackworth's book about Korean War and Vietnam War, American officer who'd written a few books, and then Nathaniel Fick, who'd been a platoon commander with a Marine Force Recon unit in Iraq, wrote a book, One Bullet Away, which was the unit that the TV series Generation Kill had been based on. So I'd read a lot of their books, and they were my professional heroes is I wanted to be a platoon commander. Would kind of be up there with them. Look, and I never really got to war in uniform. I led a platoon in the Solomon Islands, but it was somewhat of an armed vacation over there at the time. Very, very much a peacekeeping and assistance mission to the Solomon Islands police force and government. And the operations around it, of the unit structures and your task groups and the experience of living overseas, is pretty similar to then in later life. I did spend a lot of time in war zones. Some of those aspects are the same, just the danger and the ever-present threat situation is what's different, but the vibe of what it's like to live on a forward operating base in a peacekeeping mission or in the middle of a war zone, some of those vibes are actually exactly the same. It doesn't matter if you're at 100 meters from the front line or there is no front line because it's a peacekeeping op. Some of the community aspects of being in those scenarios is quite similar.
And what fueled the change in moving into sort of working for the Department of Foreign Affairs and Trade?
It was pretty simple. When I got back from the Solomons, I looked at the career in uniform and we had that mapped out of, okay, you do this and you do that. But at the same time, I was looking at, okay, we'd been working with Foreign Affairs and Trade over there, working with the Australian High Commission in Honiara, and a big part of the regional assistance mission involved that kind of operations with all the different government agencies, federal police and DFAT and stuff. And when I got back, I kind of went, maybe I want to be in international relations and I wanted to be in that space. And maybe I was better placed in a suit than a uniform. And when I spoke to the Army careers advisors and the generals and brigadiers that sort of guide the junior officer corps, you just didn't have any control over your fate in your military career. And now you could get lucky, and at times, if you're doing well and you perform well and you work hard, you probably get to where you want to get to. But it was certainly a bigger roll of the dice, and I wanted more control of my destiny. Whereas with Foreign Affairs and Trade and AFP or any of the other government agencies, you'll have a better ability to influence. Okay, I'm going to apply for this position or apply for that job, and if I go and do this particular language or these particular courses, I'll then position myself to go to that location or that particular job role. And that was what appealed to me. Like, hang on a minute, I'll have a lot more say over my career. And the other flip side of it is that when I was with DFAT, I was there for a decade. I spent more than half that time, even probably around 75% of that time, overseas doing the job you're supposed to do. Wow. Whereas with the ADF, certainly there's plenty of officers that spent that particular decade deployed to war zones whenever they wanted to be. But you also had to spend a lot of time not in your primary role, doing kind of other roles that defense says so. And you don't always get to do the job you want to do. And that was another appeal of DFAT, that you're out there diploming, as I used to call it, all the time.
And during this time, you lived and worked in countries like Iraq and Pakistan. What did you learn about the difference of culture and, I guess, sort of bringing that in sort of humanity in general?
You certainly, I grew up in Melbourne, a relatively good upbringing and whatnot. So it's certainly pretty confronting to go to the third world. I had that experience with some holidays around Southeast Asia and then that trip to the Solomons. You kind of do get a better take on humanity and how most of the world live, not how we live. Certainly in Australia's got one of the highest standards of living you'd see anywhere. But when you're working I was in Pakistan for 3 and a bit years, and you've got some of the worst elements of humanity right in front of your face, from the conflict side of it, in terms of the brutality of the insurgency and the war that was going on at the time. I was there 2011 to 2015, so I think kind of the height of the war against the Taliban in Afghanistan and everything, and that certainly crossed over the border and had a big impact on Pakistan. But you've also got famine and childhood malnutrition and all these other elements of pretty much all of the world's problems in a country that's also spending millions of dollars on its nuclear arsenal in case it has to go to war with India. It's fighting an insurgency. It's trying to deal with childhood famine and malnutrition, all these different aspects. And you really see how, but you also see some of the best bits of humanity in terms of what resilience and, overcoming adversity really is all about, when you've got families that just get torn apart of, if they might have 5 kids, only 3 of them will make it to working age, and then almost every parent you meet has lost an infant through disease or accident or all sorts of things. They've all lost brothers, sisters, cousins, mothers, fathers in various ways through just, and it's such a tragedy when you go, geez, that's a preventable. They're like, oh, my my son died of diabetes, and you're like, oh, that must have been tough. That does happen in Australia. But you're like, generally, it's actually pretty treatable. And that's a real tragedy where you go, hang on a minute, these people are dying and they don't have to, or what more can we do? And it's very hard to then help everyone. So you have to come to peace with, you do what you can. And we had some great programs through AusAid and with the United Nations and others in those sort of locations to do what you can to help everyone. But you're not going to be able to fix all the world's problems, certainly not in 3 years as one diplomat, but you keep trying.
And what is that like? Did you have a moment like that where you felt like the world, so to speak, was on your shoulders and you kind of had to have like a talk with yourself about, being realistic about what you were capable of doing as an individual?
I never had a real moment. I think I probably went in there with my eyes open to that of you're not going to solve all the problems. This is probably contrary to what I was saying before about, a young junior officer should be bright-eyed and bushy-tailed and arrogant, and a junior diplomat or anyone in that space generally would go to their first posting trying to go, right, I am going to solve all of this country's problems with my brilliant cable writing and influence on the government and reporting back to Australia. But I probably went into that posting with a more open mind of, hey, I know that there's so much going on here. And Australia's role in the political spectrum and diplomatically with Pakistan's relatively small compared to the NATO countries and the US and the region. It's a bit more removed. So even as an Australian High Commission and our ability to plug in through AusAid and organisations like UNDP and UNHCR, we didn't have a huge amount of influence, and that probably tempered our own expectations of what you as an individual Australian diplomat can achieve in a country like Pakistan in 3 years.
So how did you end up being a station leader in Antarctica?
Yeah, so I first went to Antarctica at the end of that posting to Pakistan with a bunch of mates, some of whom had been in Afghanistan and some had been in Pakistan, and we all kind of got together with our cashed up war zone bank accounts and chartered a yacht and sailed down to Antarctica from South America for a month to go splitboarding and mountaineering, which was absolutely unique. And not that many people had really been snowboarding down on the Antarctic Peninsula before us. It was relatively new to have the technology of split boards that could do it, and the people silly enough to think that was a great idea. So off we went, sailed down there, got to see the Antarctic Peninsula is one of the most incredible places on earth. You just got these massive mountains coming straight out of the ocean, penguins, whales, and orca whales, not blue whales, but humpback whales and all sorts of things, pilot whales and whatnot. And so I went down there to go mountaineering, but fell in love with the wildlife and the wilderness of the place. I thought, geez, I need to do this professionally. I need to get someone to pay me to come down here. And I wanted to just do more of it. And then I went back, I went across to it. I was in Iraq then for a year or so. And as that wrapped up and my time there came to a close, I just went, all right, I've had enough of war zones. Let's go get a job down in Antarctica. And I'd spoken to a few people who'd been down before in different roles. And I had the right, then having been a infantry officer and a diplomat, those two skill sets came together pretty naturally to then run an Antarctic station, which runs somewhat similarly to a forward operating base of a deployed military task force, but obviously it's there for science, not warfare. So your main effort is getting scientists out in the field, not combat capabilities. And yet a lot of the medical facilities in the back end in terms of the aviation and maritime and logistical and communications elements of it all are exactly the same, and often it's the same equipment and same skill sets of, you do get a lot of people that so it was actually a pretty easy transition, but a much more relaxed and collegiate and fun vibe of people going on this Antarctic adventure down there. You've got all this Australia's best scientists, and everyone's sort of a lot more excited to be out there and about and exploring and seeing all the sights and stopping to smell the penguins along the way.
And you wrote a book,
I did.
537 Days of Winter.
Yep. And I'm now just regretting I should have called it Stopping to Smell the Penguins. That's going to be the title of my next book.
I highly recommend it.
Yeah.
What happened for this experience to now become a book?
Yeah. So if everything had gone to plan, I would have come back and I would have never got a book deal and you'd have never heard of me, and I wouldn't have had the joy of being on your podcast.
We would have missed out all the good jokes too.
Yeah, exactly. So I went down as the station leader to Davis Station on a 1-year contract, and we left Australia in October 2019. We went down on one of the last voyages of the Australia's icebreaker, the Aurora Australis, which was due to retire, and there was a new vessel being built in Romania that was going to be finished, complete sea trials, and then come and pick us up in November a year later. And if that couldn't happen, we've got an air link to the Antarctic stations now that would have come and picked us up. As everyone knows, 2020 didn't go to plan. So very early on, it became evident that the new ship wasn't going to be complete. They couldn't use the old ship anymore. It was out of survey. And then we got the grim news on the 23rd of June, 2020, when we were only a few months away from when we should have been going home, that they said, actually, it's worse than we thought. We can't get the air link open to your station. We're going to have to do very limited operations, even across the other stations. So you're going to have to stay there for a second summer. It'll take it out to, 537 days was the total. There was a lot of uncertainty of if it would go even longer. We had pretty good faith they would get us out when they did, but there was a small element in the back of our minds of, geez, this could drag on. And even then, we didn't know what we were coming home to. And I think that's something when you talk about having to deal with that adversity and anxiety of, okay, swim to the horizon, or wait to the end, or look forward to, okay, when I just get through this and then I get to that phase and then I'm home. But for us, we didn't really know what we were coming home to. And it was hard to gauge what was happening with the pandemic in the different states and different nations and exactly what our home would be like when we got home. But eventually we did, and 537 days after we left, we came home to a world that, if you think about what Australia was like in October 2019 and then what Australia was like in April 2021, we time traveled that period. So when I got home, I had no idea what was going on with some of the just social etiquette elements of the whole thing. And by that point, everyone was pretty well bedded in with their routines. And I was still trying to, and my whole team were the same, depending on where they went back to in Australia and New Zealand, trying to work out how to adjust.
Yeah. What was that like, sort of coming back into that space? Because I went through it being here in Australia, and it was certainly interesting and challenging at the best of times. What was that like? Were people like, did it feel humane? Did you have trouble connecting with people? Like, how was it sort of showing up in your life?
The toughest thing was, everyone expected when I got home, all I'd want to do was kind of catch up with everyone and kind of, party as much as you could party in April 2021, which was kind of the eye of the storm. Now you look back on it, you could get out and about. There was still a few rules and restrictions, but it wasn't too bad. There was really, in Melbourne, just capacity caps on restaurants and things was about it, but you didn't have to wear masks that much. And so all I wanted to do, and other members of my team were the same, if you actually, after spending so long, there was only 24 of us in that winter team for that period, and you're pretty cramped. The station's well laid out and you do get some privacy, but you are pretty cramped as a group. And I wanted to just be alone for quite a bit of time to get my own headspace right and just sleep and relax and kind of debrief myself before I got out and saw people. And so I think it confused some friends and family of like, they're like, oh, let's catch up. And I'm like, actually, no, because I got sick of explaining the same story all the time. And then it became really hard to understand what everyone had been through. And I started to realize there was a number of people I knew that they'd really struggled or they'd really changed in that year and a half more than they knew, or they didn't realize what impact lockdown and losing their jobs or changing jobs and re-rolling. And there was a lot of people had existential kind of crises around what am I doing with my life? What am I doing? Blah, blah, blah. So trying to understand that whilst deal with my own issues of readjusting was tough to get that balance right, and being selfish at times to go, no, I can't deal with your shit because I'm dealing with my, sorry to swear on this podcast, but I can't deal with your shit because I'm struggling to deal with my own shit. So I'd love to help you, but until I help myself, I can't help you. And that was something as well, even chatting to, we all did psych debriefs and stuff when I got back. And that was one of the best bit of advice I think I ever got from a psych after that was like, after such a an experience where you've had to do so much as a group to help each other through it. Well done. But now don't be afraid to just prioritize yourself, be selfish and do you. And then, probably 6 months to a year later, I was kind of back to what I would say was normal.
So there's 24 people at the station.
Yep.
Clearly a time of adversity. What was sort of the common vulnerabilities that were showing up amongst people?
Good question. The self-awareness played a big part of it. So those that were more self-aware, I think, probably did better to understand what others were doing to accommodate their habits or nuances or frustrations. It was always, and it's hard to generalize because there's 24 of us and everyone did an amazing job to get through it individually and as a group, but we certainly had our ups and downs, and there's no real one thing that was sort of the way it manifested it. But it was, sorry, I can't give you a straight answer on that one because it's hard to quantify, but I think it came down to, if you understood your motivations around why you were there in the first place, it would help you overcome a lot of the other challenges that would come up along the way and help you tolerate others a bit more and be like, that's right, we're all in the same boat. And that was something we used to say a lot was, we're all in the same boat here. So if you're frustrated because, Jen's doing this or Dave's doing that, you had to be like, no, that's okay, because that's them. Let them do them and I'll just give them more space. And you'd have times where you might go, all right, my outlet, and my two outlets have always been for mental health, music and gym, right? And they're pretty common, pretty standard, exercise and kind of mindless music or whatever it is. So you could find space to grab a guitar and go to one of the rooms and play a bit of guitar or something like that. But if you walked in there and there's someone else on the guitar, or there's someone on the phone, which was also in one of the band rooms, you're like, who designed this thing? But that was the thing. And you go, okay, I can't do that. I'll go to the gym. And you go to the gym, and someone that you kind of trying to get away from for the day, or you've had a tense conversation earlier, they're sitting in the gym doing, and you're like, you couldn't get that time away. And whereas, and I think that wears you down over, over a year and a half, that just don't have any control over some of those aspects. And yet from the mental health side of things, we always, you talk about sphere of control and, focus on the things you can control and then focus on how you can face anything you can't control. But at times when you're like, all I want to do is face the freaking treadmill and there's someone else on it. So it can get, a lot of those theories are really good and they're a good start line. But what we got to experience was a really good lived experience of the realities of some of those, putting those theories into practice going, well, they might be good on a spreadsheet or on a diagram with a sphere or a triangle. Right. But I can tell you that some of them are pretty hard to kind of push through. Yeah.
And you mentioned wise. Did you notice, and again, I'm sort of saying commonalities, but you go where you want with this, between the people that were like more positive and growth orientated when they had a certain type of why, compared to like people that may not be as much like that?
Yeah. And that was a huge one. So to keep ourselves like busy and stimulated, we ran a lot of workshops and classes. So on every Wednesday night, we'd do like a TED Talks night where you could talk about, I talked about like my Antarctic expedition, and other people talk about holidays or talk about their own profession, or we'd do like Space Club and we'd watch space launches, or we'd watch an interesting movie. Like film festival movies or artistic movies or foreign language films. We'd do that on sort of Wednesday nights. And then we did community college nights. I think we did on Mondays or Tuesdays or something. And you'd have, okay, let's, one of the engineers ran a kind of little electrical workshop, and you could do all these different learning activities. But we kind of realized later in the season, it's actually the same people that do all of those things that are the more active members of the community. And I think in a general way, they had a better sense of adventure, but they also had a better sense of community in terms of involvement. And did they necessarily do better or worse? Did anyone do better or worse? Getting through it was tough for everyone, but I felt they got more out of it, that when they got home or when we catch up with them, you catch up now and you go, well, you remember some of those moments and you go, well, that was kind of what it was worth to go down and try and learn off each other and learn different things. Whereas others who potentially their outlets were more individual, or they just spent more time doing their own thing. And you don't know what's going on in someone's world back home. So it's hard to know that you might think, oh, they're just in their room playing PlayStation all the time, when actually, they're on the phone for hours every night, consoling family or friends over something, and they'll never tell you about it. So that can be a challenge too, to not judge and say, oh, this person's not really doing anything in the community. You don't know what's going on in their own head. And if they don't tell you, you can't know. And that stuff was tough. But yeah, I'd certainly think there was, the more and it was the same there was the same group from those first extracurricular activities right to the end.
And obviously this is a time of like immense uncertainty. In reading your book, you really feel those moments where people think they're going home and then they find out that they're not. And you really feel also from the point of view of being a leader, having to communicate these messages. What did you sort of bring into that community in terms of being able to deal with, manage better this level of uncertainty?
Yeah, it was tough. So I had to break the news a lot of the time, which meant you take a bit of heat as the messenger. What I tried to do then afterwards was work. Group settings were tougher, because it's you kind of trying to, almost like a press conference at times at an angry station meeting, but then individually working with someone that either didn't quite understand the context behind a decision, to then just go through the thought processes to understand a tough scenario and go, okay, I know we're all supposed to go home and they've changed the schedules and the ship's not available and all this sort of stuff. And if they didn't understand it, you go, okay, let's talk through. I'm going to put you in the mindset of the person that made this decision. And if you want, I can get them on the phone. And we even did that a couple of times. And then you go, but I can explain all of the things around this and try and answer the questions that people were coming up with of, well, why can't they do this? Or what about this? Or what's happened there? And then same with the mental health aspect of it. We sort of had three main avenues to help an individual in the group and the group as a whole. And that was myself as the station leader, the deputy station leader, who was the chef, Rhonda in the book, and the absolute backbone of morale and community. And then the doctor as well was there as, he's the GP on station. You only got one doctor, you can do a whole range of things, but he was also kind of sat outside the chain of command. And if you wanted to just go sit down in his office in a swivel chair and talk shit, you could go and do that. And so everyone had different ways to manage it. And I found for myself, and a number of the team had the same approach, that when you wanted to vent, or you needed to talk through issues you were having on station, or with the group or your boss or your team, speaking to someone at one of the other Australian stations or people that had been down previously, to go, hey, we've got this issue as a community. And they go, oh, and they'd often laugh at you and be like, oh yeah, that happens every year, or that's happened before. And you try and you could, it's such a unique scenario down there that you can't explain it to other people. And it's one of the best things to do is, speak to someone that's been there, talk through the issues, realize that you're not the first ones to be in a scenario like ours. We were down there longer than anyone had really been stuck there for a while, but it's still a lot of the aspects of it weren't unheard of. It just, we had them all in one particular year, or one particular year and a half. So that was something you just call the other people who've had these situations, and they'll say, oh no, everything that's happening to you is normal, or that happened before, or try this, try that, keep going. You'll get there, and eventually you get to come home.
And what was it like for you personally as a leader, having to lead a team that certainly towards the end of that experience probably didn't want to actually be there?
Yeah, well, I mean, like I said, at all the station meetings, we're all in the same boat. So it was at a point where no one wanted to be there and no one was supposed to be there, but it was, how do you face that and make the most of the opportunity? And there was some great opportunities in spending that much time down there. And trying to reframe that, I'd often have to take a blindly positive approach to the whole scenario, because as a leader, you sign up for that. And being an Antarctic station leader, you kind of know in the back of your mind that this sort of thing can happen. So you have to be that committed to not just, it's a 1-year contract and then I go home, and like, wait a minute, you can't extend us. As the station leader, you kind of take it on. They're like, well, that's part of your job. And I kind of agree that people have asked me, and I do kind of agree with it. In some ways, it's easier when you're in a leadership position to just go, well, great, it's my job to make this work and rise to that challenge. Whereas potentially, if I wasn't in a leadership position, I might have made different decisions or acted differently. But it was certainly something that I consciously, when we were told like, hey, you're going to be there much longer and it's all looking pretty uncertain, I went up for a walk by myself just to kind of think about how to really wrap my head around the news and how to frame it and go through who was going to be affected the worst. And then went and spoke to some of them individually, and then we spoke to everyone as a group, and then came back together a couple of days later to talk through what do we want the second summer to look like? What are some of the changes we can make as a community? You know, we've set everything up to get through 12 months. Now we're going to have to go through 18 months. What do we change as a group and as individuals and jobs and social things? And you kind of just constantly trying to steer it and keep it actively going in the right direction. And I think, as you said, towards the end, it was much harder to steer it, but you still kept trying to just shuffle. I'm using my hands a lot for the podcast, but you're trying to shuffle it in the right direction and accepting that you're not going to get a perfect solution and you're not going to get 100% positive input. And, you know, not everyone can reframe it and go, oh, well, this is great. What an opportunity. Because they're like, I've got a wife and 3 kids back home. Like, you don't understand. You're like, yeah, fair, cool. And that's sort of, that was part of it, that accepting that even success is going to feel pretty disastrous at times. And that was true for myself and others.
You mentioned a term in your book, loneliness of command.
Yeah. Actually, I didn't mention that. The Governor General did.
Is that something that you experienced?
Absolutely. And that's, so the Governor General wrote the foreword for the book, which was, I was honored that he did that for me, which was great. And that was kind of the setup for it, is that he, as a former military general, he has a big interest in leadership stories and veteran stories. So he was really happy to do that. And he wrote about that as my book and my story being a really good example of the loneliness of command, because that everyone on station is technically subordinate to you, but certainly I felt the doctor and my deputy station leader were the closest thing to peers I had, and I could confide in, and they could confide in me. We had a good relationship, and I had a couple other leaders of the teams on station that at different times you could go, all right, we've got the same issue, we're now equal. And you could break that loneliness and at times I'd go out on field trips where I wouldn't be in charge of the field trip. So yes, I'm still the station leader, but this person's now the trip leader, and I can kind of sit back. Now you've still got to behave yourself and you're still being judged as the station leader, but for a weekend or something, you're not in command. And that's, again, that loneliness aspect. The best way to deal with it was to speak to the other station leaders or former station leaders and understand that I wasn't alone in my experiences. But when you turn off the Zoom call, you're now alone in your office, sitting there with a team to lead when you've had a tough week and things aren't going well, and you've got to go and sit at the dinner table with a group of people that you can feel don't really like you anymore.
Yeah. And how does this play specifically into remote leadership? Do you feel like this loneliness of command, quote unquote, is kind of enhanced when you're also being a leader in a remote zone like Antarctica?
100%. And you have to accept that if you want a leadership position in a remote, and on a remote Antarctic station or a remote, mining camp or any other, oil rigs, whatever. There's a lot of really isolated communities out there and different roles and jobs. And if you want one of those things, you do have to understand that when it's all going well, when it's all sunshine and penguins, it'll be fine. You'll be able to be friends with everyone. Everyone will kind of like you and respect you, and you'll have all these, you'll be fine. When it gets tough, e.g. you're stuck in Antarctica longer than you wanted to be, and there's a global pandemic and whatnot, you've got to get comfortable with the fact that you're going to have to make unpopular decisions, and you're not going to be friends with everyone, and you need to just go, right, are the decisions I'm making the best for everyone as a community? And if that means that there's a few individuals that don't see it that way, or they don't want to understand it, that's not you, that's them. And it's really hard to get that, because you as a human and myself, I always felt this, like you want group harmony. You want everyone to get along and be friends and go, what a great experience and blah, 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 blah. But at a point, I'm like, geez, this is impossible. Like, it's just not happening. And that's just humans, and the limits we were pushed to, I had to kind of reconcile, and I'd have these moments where you just, man, I wish, if someone else could have done a better job of this, or could they? And then you go like, could they? And I don't know, and I chat to other, station leaders or my boss and others, and go like, oh, I've tried, I did this and I did that and I've tried this. And they'd be like, mate, if you've tried all those things and you've still got these issues, you're like, well, you can't do much more. And you're like, well, but I can't fix them. And you just always want to fix the problem and get it all back to day one harmony. And by day 537, you're just like, well, you're just not going to do it. And you've got to accept that when you want. I think a lot of leaders and teams learned this in the last couple of years with the pandemic, that, it was fine to be a manager of whatever, of a couple of people pre-pandemic. But the minute you got the pandemic, and you might be managing a team of 3, and one of them's anti-vax, one of them's homeschooling 2 young children with a husband who lost their job, and the third one, doesn't care. And you go, now you've actually got to lead. You're not just managing. You've got to set examples. You've got to deal with tough employees and all that sort of stuff. So it was, I think everyone learned similar lessons to what we learned down south.
Yeah, it reminds me, I was perusing YouTube and came across a few videos of you guys sort of at the start of the pandemic making hilarious videos, which I highly recommend people go check out. It's a very good laugh, just sort of on social isolation aspects, but sort of utilizing the wildlife and the environment around you guys to make these videos. Talk to me about that, because to my understanding, it looked certainly very harmonious at the beginning of that experience, lots of laughter and jokes. Sort of how did that unfold?
I love that. That was one of my favorite memories. So it was in March 2020. So just as the pandemic had unfolded, everyone back home's been told, don't worry, it's just a 2-week lockdown to flatten the curve. And, we'll work from home where you can for a couple of weeks, and we'll all be back to normal after we flatten the curve and sort this out. So if you can cast your mind back to that. But we got a brief from the Australian Antarctic Division's media team, and they said, hey, can you, they said, we're getting a few requests from different media outlets around Australia to do some clips about what we do on the Antarctic stations when there's a blizzard and when you can't go outside and when you're stuck indoors. Like, what do we do? And you go, oh yeah, we've got, a lot of experience with that. So they sort of said, hey, can you put some stuff together? And we thought, all right, well, rather than just do some boring pieces to camera where you go, hi, I'm Dave, and we like to play video games and read books when there's a pandemic. You go, okay, let's do something more exciting. And we got the team together and ran what we called COVID as a kind of film festival thing, and sent little groups off of like, okay, you 3 go and film a sketch, you 3 film a sketch, you guys over there. We set up a kind of news desk panel thing where we did some interview things, and everyone gets to play these different roles. So people could be videographers, people could be news interviewers, and the guys and girls came up with these great sketches. And they went down and filmed in front of like elephant seals on the beach, and because like at the time there was all these people still going to Bondi Beach. So the guy that
there's
did
always
that,
one guy.
Yeah, exactly. I think they ran with a version. We shot 2 versions of that clip where one he kind of blamed, Bondi Beach residents, and then I think they used the take that we didn't name Bondi for that one. But and then we put it together, and the Antarctic media team did a really good job of kind of editing it all and putting funny music and stuff over the top, and then it went viral, and it got thousands, and I think it even got millions of hits on the Facebook page. It was great, and that was back at the start when everyone was COVID and lockdowns and stuff were a bit of a novelty. So that was fun. And we and those little compulsory fun activities at the time, people turn up and I'd be like, hey, here's another wacky idea from the station leader, and you get a few eye rolls. But I think at the end of the day, you look back and those little memories are great to now for people to go like, oh yeah, that was us, that was our year, we did that. And
yeah. And you focused on developing a culture of transparency and growth.
Yeah.
How did you come to decide on those 2 things being sort of the points of focus?
I think given that you're living and working with your team, you just have to be transparent on that. There were certainly things that I'd pick the time to discuss them or get them out there, but And not always, like I think, like I said before, there'd be times where you go, you know what, I'll tell you what's happening. If you want to know more, just come and see me later. And you're just always happy to explain anything and everything to anyone. And that often took up a lot of my day, would be then explaining other stuff or explaining the why. But you go, well, there's half the group that don't care and they'll just get on with it, or it doesn't affect them, and the other half do. And you're transparent and open, but not always in the same way. So that's just a reality of living with everyone. And also, that meant that at times you'd have to sit around after hours explaining things over a glass of wine or a cup of tea. And you just go, well, that's part of the job, that I'm here and I'm happy to talk about it and whatnot. The growth stuff that's always been my approach. And that's where encouraging things like the community college and the TED Talks. And you don't always have to be the one that's pushing it, but you're creating the opportunity, allowing it.
Yeah.
And that was where I knew, like, if we're going to be down here, even if we'd just been there for the year we were supposed to, but even, the extension, you have to keep people stimulated and give them some opportunities to learn and be creative and do more than just, count the days and get home. Right. And that I've always found from my experience in my previous professions, if you can keep learning, and was it Ancora Ampara, I think, is a quote for Monash Uni, in terms of never stop learning. And that's just, I think it's probably one of the few things I've taken from uni, but you just keep learning, and you might learn something. And if you learn something, you didn't fail, and you'll learn a lot more from a failure than you will success.
And to my understanding, you did quite a bit of soul searching and contemplating out in the beautiful station that you were. What did you reflect on? What did you learn about yourself?
It's a good question. I learned that I was really proud of my efforts at the end and along the way, of like, geez, when it got tough, or when you did fail, when you did make mistakes, or when it was falling apart, you kept going. Nice. That I'd always had a mantra, quitting's not an option. And certainly, without giving too many spoilers away for the book and the story, there was members of the team that didn't necessarily have that approach to some elements of the lifestyle down there. And I was kind of like, all right, it was good to really know, all right. And kind of like what to your question earlier about who my heroes were as a junior officer, that I felt in terms of the way we were pushed, and in terms of the uncertainty of all the things going on, then I'm like, right, at the end of the day, it may not have been pretty, but I got there and I kept going, and I found ways to be creative to the end, to keep pushing the team and getting it done, and all get home safely. And you go, right, that's great. You now know that's your limit. But I also learned the cost of that limit. It cost me in terms of my emotional exhaustion when I got home and all that. I'd learned a lot more about, like, geez, you can succeed and do everything, and then you're wrecked. Kind of something you run, ultra marathons and whatnot. You can do it, but geez, you're not going to be great for a bit afterwards. And you kind of learn that emotional recovery is just as important as physical recovery from something like this.
Upon that reflection, do you feel like if you were put in the same situation, that you would do it all again the same, or in knowing about that emotional exhaustion when you got home, would there be sort of a new sort of approach in doing it all over again?
It's a great question. I certainly didn't make all of the right decisions along the way. And
no one would.
No one would. And no one in the team was perfect. And anyone in the team that says they were perfect is kidding themselves. So, and anyone that says they could have done everything perfectly over that period of time in that circumstance is also kidding themselves. So it's a reality of humans that we fail a lot. Even monkeys fall out of trees. But I kind of wouldn't change a thing for the experience that it became. And there's certainly some. So I've been back to Antarctica since then as a voyage leader. I'm heading back down this summer as well, and as a field leader. And there's certainly some new elements to my preparation mentally as an expedition leader, to working with your team beforehand to get expectations right and make sure you've got the right methods. That if you could get that locked in at the start and improve some of those strategies, and then realize that if someone doesn't want to do it that way and they're fighting you, you might have to reassess if they're suitable for the job, or find a way that works for them and you. And if you can't, you go, well, actually, if this works for 99% of the team and not one, you go, unfortunately, that one person we're just going to not have to save. And that's the reality of Antarctic expeditions. And, and same with workplaces. You can't always make it work with everyone. So I think there's a few elements of my experience that you'd go, oh, we could have foreseen a couple of challenges, but no one could have foreseen how long we'd get stuck down there in the circumstances we were. So you also go, geez, benefit of the doubt that some of the challenges we had were only a result of the circumstance, and that in a normal year with a normal set of circumstances, we wouldn't have had a lot of the problems we faced.
Yeah, the one that comes to mind for me is, and obviously there's a fine line in being a leader because you sort of do have more expectations on yourself than other people, but people sort of coming up to you early in the morning when you've just sort of gotten out of bed and you're eating a piece of toast. Or as you shared, it's like you might have a glass of wine or a tea at night time to kind of talk with someone. They're big days to be doing, let alone doing that for sort of 18 months. Is that sort of something that you may incorporate in sort of pre-setting those expectations?
Yeah. Look, I love that story in the book, and that happened all the time. And I really didn't care. Like, it's just part of the job. You go, all right, the minute you walk out your door, and that's why one of the most important things I did when I woke up in the morning, before I left my room, I do like some push-ups and some stretches and some stuff to just do that first before I go to breakfast or before I get out there, because the minute you're out, you're on stage. And that's not just because I'm a station leader, that's everyone. The mechanics and the builders and scientists and everyone would get questions at the breakfast table. So it's like, if you go to breakfast, be ready to get questions, or even just you start work, because the minute you get up and you look at the weather, the weather data on the screens and look out the window and go, right, that's what today looks like. My brain and everyone's brain is like, okay, that's what we've got today. We've got 30 knots of wind coming from this direction. The forecast says that minus 20 degrees, blah, 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 blah. You're starting to go, what can I do today? So that was it. But the funniest one was actually recently. So now that since the book came out, and I've been doing it anyways, talks to corporates and different things, but I was at an interstate conference, and they'd flown me up. And so I was staying at the same hotel as the conference, and, I was on at 8:30 or 9 o'clock or whatever. And so I'm at the hotel that morning having brekkie. So I'm standing there, you go up to the egg guy and say, yeah, can I get the 2 poached eggs? And then you step back and you stand there. And this guy comes up and he's like, oh my God, you're the guy that's talking, you wrote the book and loved your book, blah, 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 blah. And in the back of my mind, I'm like, we obviously didn't read it that well, because there was a whole thing in there about not asking questions about stuff while I'm at breakfast. But we had a great chat, and it was just kind of funny. Then I'm like, oh, it's actually literally in the book, mate. But no, it was good. That was kind of one of those first moments where I'm like, oh, this is kind of funny.
Yeah, it's fun. Well, thanks so much for this awesome conversation.
Thank you. Great questions.
Thanks for sharing your experiences.
No,
it's awesome. It's awesome learning your mindset as well around everything.
No, my pleasure. And hopefully your listeners get something out of it.
Definitely will. On a final note, Dave, I'd love to ask you, what does it mean to you to be human?
It means to be humble and to be aware of our place on the planet. I think as well that we share this planet with some amazing species, and where we've been here for but a fraction of the Earth's history, and even less of a fraction of the rest of the universe. So to be human is to just exist in a way that is aware of our surroundings as an individual and as a species, and our impact on the rest of the planet.